but expensive. So, I mean, the moral of the story is that mail was a giant pain in the butt back then. And the world was changing. There was more migration. There was more mail being sent. So in 1874, the nations of the world got together in Bern, Switzerland, and they came up with what is now called the Universal Postal Union.
Okay, and what did that do?
So all of the countries agreed to carry each other's letters for free. So Canada Post would deliver letters sent from the United States, and the US would deliver letters that were sent from Canada, and it was all assumed that it would come out in the wash. And this was not for heavy stuff. This was for letters and small parcels under around 4 pounds. And it worked really well for nearly 100 years.
But then
there started to be some imbalances, and I have an example for you. Italians got a lot of international magazine subscriptions. Magazines are heavy, they have that heavy paper, and Italian postmen were hauling all of these magazines around the country, delivering them to people's homes. But Italy didn't send magazines out of the country, so there was a weight imbalance. And Italy was annoyed. They're like, we are delivering so much more heavy stuff than we're sending. So in the late 60s, all of the countries got together and said, okay, if you are delivering more international mail than you're sending, you should be paid for the difference. The amount that they decided on, 1/2 of 1 gold franc per kilogram of international mail.
I love that they're getting paid in gold francs.
Yeah, it's about 0.15 of a gram of gold. That's a 1/2 a gold franc.
Okay, so we've got gold francs changing hands, maybe the odd doubloon. How did the system work?
So there was a little bit of a complication within that, because not every country could afford 1/2 a gold franc per kilo. So maybe the United States could, or Canada, or even Italy. But there were also countries with mail, like with developing economies, like somewhere in Africa or Asia.
On the one hand, what we seek to achieve is compensation, cost-covering compensation for the delivery operator. But there are also objectives of around affordability.
That is Paul Schorl. He is with the Universal Postal Union. I talked to him from Bern, Switzerland, which is still the center of the postal world.
The central idea is that any citizen or business should be able to send mail packages through the UPU Global Postal Network to any destination, so thereby connecting any citizen or business from one location with a citizen or business in another location somewhere else on Earth.
He sounds exactly what I imagined a Swiss postmaster would sound like.
He takes his mail very, very seriously. And what Paul told me is that the goal was equality. Everyone should be able to send mail around the world. So what the UPU did is it set up a fee schedule where richer countries would pay more to have their international mail delivered than countries that had developing economies. And back in 1969, China was considered a country with a developing economy. And that is why China Post charges less for international mail than Canada Post does for domestic mail.
So, bam, mic drop. That's the answer.
That is the answer, but it is not the end of the story, Paul, because in the 2000s, e-commerce started to take off globally. And that meant that Chinese e-commerce companies like Alibaba had this amazing competitive advantage in which they could mail something to North America very, very cheaply, less than you could ship something within North America.
And this is what Neil wants to know. How can it possibly be cheaper to get something sent from Shanghai versus Saskatoon?
Right, and the imbalance becomes a bigger issue as we buy more and more consumer products from China. Canada Post and the U.S. Postal Service are delivering all these packages, not being compensated particularly well for it. And then, in 2018, U.S. President Trump gets wind of it. He threatens to pull out of the UPU. He said, you know what, in the United States, we want to set the rates we charge to China Post, and if you don't let us do it, we're going to pull out of the UPU. And he essentially wins this fight. The U.S. negotiates a deal where it does remain in the UPU, but it gets the power to immediately increase the rates that it charges to China and other developing countries to deliver their mail within the U.S.
So kind of classic Trump. Was this renegotiation just for the U.S.?
So other countries like Canada were part of the negotiation. But because the US is the most important country in the postal world, they got the biggest concessions. So Canada can and has also increased rates, but much more slowly over time. And I spoke with a postal expert in Denmark about this. His name is Mindaugas Serpikken, and he is an economist who studies the postal system. I reached him in Copenhagen.
The U.S. Was allowed to raise its fees, and they were allowed to do it faster than other industrialized countries. Other industrialized countries can also update their fees and are doing that within the given limits of about 16% annual increase. And 16% may sound like a lot, but one must consider that some countries, like Canada, need between 200-400% increase to close the gap between domestic rates and international rates.
So in 2021, Canada started to increase the fees that it charges countries like China by 16% a year. But I'm going to do a little bit of math here. So let's say, hypothetically, we charge China $1 to mail a package to Canada. You know, after 2021, we could charge them $1.16. And then the next year that can go up another 16%, you know, $1.35 or 36. But Canada Post, you know, according to the sort of unofficial math, charges Canadians like, you know, $4 to mail the same package. So you can see it's going to take a really long time before the fees become comparable.
And this is why, even though it seems wild that you can ship something all the way across the Pacific Ocean for cheaper than sending something like a province away.
It means that countries like China will continue to have cheaper delivery costs for quite some time.
Huh. Well, thanks, Tracy. And Neil, thank you again for the question.
Yeah, no, really, Neil, thank you, because we learned some things today.